So welcome everybody to today's eLN webinar. And I'm delighted to say this one is all about translations, the big wins of translating e-learning content. And our speakers today are Emily and Sophie from Comtec, who are a new e-learning network industry partner. So I'm not going to say too much more. I've put in a membership poll for you to fill in. So please do fill that in. And then I will go on to mute and I will hand over to Emily and Sophie.
Great. Well, thank you very much to all of you for joining our webinar. It's great to see that you're all interested in finding out more about the big wins of translating e-learning content. So to start off, we'd just like to introduce ourselves. So just introduce myself first. So I'm Sophie, Director at Comtec Translations. I've been working in the industry for about 15 years now, managing Comtec in its development and growth. I obviously have a language background myself as well. In the time of working in Comtec, I've worked with clients across a wide range of sectors, lots of different functions, with a particular focus in HR, in e-learning, and also in marketing. I've seen, in the last 5 years, a fantastic growth in the services, in the e-learning localization services that we deliver to our clients. So this is a key area for us, and an expertise that we're rapidly developing. I'm now going to hand over to Emily.
Hi, so I'm Emily. I'm an account manager here at Comtec, and I work with a number of e-learning clients and supporting them with their translation requirements. So most recently, I have helped a client deliver 7 storyline modules across 17 languages. Not only the text elements of that, but also the media, so the images, the videos, and also implementing the translations directly into storyline as well. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of that expertise with you today.
Great. So it's now over to you. So we would really like to understand what your role is in the development of e-learning content. So we're going to put out a poll. If you could select the option that's most appropriate for you. If other is the best option, it'd be great if you could share some information about your role in the chat room. And please do feel free to share any observations or any questions you have as we go along in the chat area, and we'll either look at those as we go, or we'll pick them up in the Q&A session at the end. So I'll just give you a minute or so just to put in your answers there.
So we've got Joe, who is a freelancer specialising in FCA compliance. Thank you, Joe. We've got Natalie, who works for a company and produces the content. Thank you, Natalie.
Brilliant.
Anyone else like to share? Also, we've got quite a different spread.
So we've got so the 3 in the group that work in an agency to produce the learning content. So that's great. We'll have lots of good information to share with you about translations and how to handle translations alongside the content production. And as a freelancer, then obviously you should get a really good view of all the different elements and how translation fits into the overall process. Great.
Lots of good feedback coming in.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant.
That's brilliant. Content designer at the Cabinet Office. Thank you very much, Kaylee there. And Richard's just generally curious about offering learning in multiple languages. So hopefully we'll give you some things to get you thinking about that.
Some food for thought.
Food for thought. Brilliant. Okay, so what would we like to cover in our session today? So we'll kick off with a very quick introduction on Comtec. Then we'll look at the case for investing in translation. So why is it worthwhile making that investment? We'll then look at the real benefits of offering translation as part of your service offering. If you are an e-learning provider, content provider, then we'll look at what the benefits are of offering translation as part of your services. I'm then going to hand over to Emily, who's going to talk very much about the practicalities around translations, looking at, for example, how to take translation into consideration from the very start when you're developing the source content, to make that process as easy as possible. And then finally, to look at some of the key questions that you could be asking your translation partner when you start looking at quotations and project planning for localization. So an introduction, just to start off, an introduction, just a quick intro on Comtec. So we've been around quite a long time, nearly approaching the 40-year mark. We offer translation, localization, and interpreting service. We cover 200 languages. When it comes to e-learning, beyond the translation element, we offer the whole complete package. So we can support in adapting the content to ensure it's culturally relevant, to localizing the images, artworking. We handle also the voiceover, the subtitling for all the audio content, and also the rebuild at the end. We work with a whole range of packages, so storyline, captivate, adapt, the whole range. In terms of language, as I said, we cover about 200, but our core languages is obviously based on the demand from our clients, covers probably about 50. We can cover that whole range of languages because we work with a global network of linguists. So they're all based all over the world. They are all specialist linguists. They all specialise in particular fields. So we can make sure we're picking the right linguist for the particular requirement, for the particular type of content that needs to be localised. And just a final point there about quality, we're ISO 9001 and 17100 accredited, and we are pretty fanatical about quality. Quality really is key for us. We very much appreciate that our clients are trusting us to make sure that what we are translating is what it should say, and quality is really key for us to make sure that we can earn that trust as much as possible. So just an overview really of the clients that we work with, some of the clients that we work with in the e-learning sector. As you can see, there's a real broad spread there. Clients with content, lots of different types of content for lots of different industry sectors, all using different authoring tools. So we really pride ourselves on offering that flexibility to fit in with your bespoke requirements around e-learning localization. So that's really just an introduction, a quick intro on Comtec. But moving on to the very important topic of what are the big wins. So let's look at the bigger picture first and think about what are the priorities around learning and development, and what are the potential links then with the demand for translation and for translation as such. So first, sort of looking at the 2018 LinkedIn workplace learning report, and we've included a link to the report in the chat area. In the survey that they did with, it was about 4,000 professionals that they surveyed, they asked, what was your priority for L&D? And number one was how to train for soft skills. This was in 2018. But number two was delivering consistent global training. So global is the key word here, and it was all about how to scale that training globally across the organisation. But then moving on to the 2019 report. The report showed some really positive changes in the industry with professionals, L&D professionals, saying they had a lot more access to budget and a lot more influence in their organisation. So there's a lot more buy-in to investment in L&D than there's ever been before. So if you combine those two things, that greater focus on delivering global training with access to a greater budget and more buy-in, then we can see that the demand for translations is set to really grow, and we can see that ourselves in the rapid increase in the number of projects, e-learning and training localization projects that we are managing for our clients. So we've looked at what the priorities are for L&D, but why specifically invest in training e-learning, in translating e-learning content? You know, surely you might hear, surely the business language is English. Why bother? Well, it's true that English is often the business language for many multinational organisations, but when it comes to learning, there's nothing more effective than receiving that training in your own native language. And there's a wealth of evidence, particularly in the marketing sphere, to show how much more receptive people are to communications when it's in their own language. And if we look at some of the research that's been done by organisations like Common Sense Advisory, they've shown how much more likely consumers are to buy products online if the website and the information about that product is available in their own language. But looking more specifically at research around learning and development, there was some research done by the Rosetta Stone Foundation, which showed that connection between delivering training in their own language and the benefits that brings. And when training, and the findings were that when training and learning is not delivered in their native language, 42% said productivity had gone down, 46% said employees couldn't contribute effectively. But if we flip it around the other way, when the training is available in their native language, some of the key benefits were, higher learner engagement, increased collaboration, and generally better learning outcomes. So there's a really strong case there for investing in translation of training content. Many of you and your clients may, of course, be very much already bought into this, but we still find there's a lot more work to convince people at senior level what the benefits are, to make sure that companies are really taking advantage of those opportunities. So before we look at why it's worthwhile for you, the e-learning provider, to handle the translation of learning content, we would like to ask you about your experience of translation services. So do your clients handle the translations themselves, or do you manage the translations with a translations partner? Or please share if you don't have any experience yet.
So I'll just give you a few minutes to answer the poll.
Yeah.
Just a reminder, in case people haven't noticed, the link to that to those reports are in the chat. I reloaded them for you.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you.
So Natalie manages translations with a translation partner. Be great to hear a little bit later on, Natalie, how that's going for you. Any more results in?
I think I'll just publish the result now. Not everybody's filled it in, but it may be because they're not actually doing it yet.
Okay.
Great. Well, it'd be great to hear later on from those that have had the experience, that they are managing the translation with a translations partner, just to share their experience of that and things that are working well, or areas that you might be finding challenging. That would be great to share later on.
And for the people who haven't got any experience yet, hopefully we can give you some good tips for when you eventually do get the chance to. So
yes.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. So before I hand over to Emily, it's just to look really at some of the big wins from investing in your translation capability as an e-learning provider. So what are the things what are the real wins for you if you take that on rather than allowing your client to handle the translations? Well, the key thing here is that the translation element should really be an enhancement to your service, not a distraction. So with the right translation partner on board, you should be able to offer translation as part of a seamless process where you focus on your core expertise, developing the e-learning content, and your translation partner can take care of the rest. So with the right processes in place, which includes all the different elements, so the voiceover, subtitling, image localization, rebuild, all handled by your translation partner, you should be able to offer that service in a way that allows you to really focus on your core, but offer that broader element as well. Of course, with that additional service included, it opens you up obviously to a wider client base potentially, at a more international client base. Also, looking at the quality of the localized versions. If you've obviously in developing the content, there's a lot of expertise and time put into developing a high quality content, and by offering that localization as part of your service, you would have the confidence with the right partner in place that the localized versions are exactly the same quality with exactly the same creativity, that they're fully localized for all those markets. So both the English and the translations are at the same level.
Can I interrupt a second, Sophie?
Yes.
Given that we have got some people on who are not experienced, could you just explain the term localization for people?
So yes, certainly. So localization is all about making sure that the content is fully localized for that local culture. So it means that it's not just about the words; it's about the imagery, it's about the style, the design of that content. That it's fully adapted to the target culture for that market. Translation in itself suggests it is a much more of a literal, much more of a straightforward literal process, whereas localization takes on the whole package. So you've got the whole cultural adaptation as part of that process.
Yeah, so Joan has just flagged as an example the red flag. That's not necessarily an image that translates well across all countries. So the image of a red flag to an English-speaking audience would be quite obvious that it's a warning. But for other regions like China, for example, that like intuitive meaning just isn't there because that idea doesn't exist in China. So it's just kind of adapting those kind of things as well as the actual text as well.
Is that if any more questions in that area, then please do share in the chat area. But the other, just another final point about the benefits for you as an e-learning provider is a lot to do with the control of the process. So in the translation process, it is complex. There are a lot of stages which Emily will share with you, but while you're managing that, you have obviously control over that process. So things the time delays that might pop up and things like that when you're relying on the client to feed things through can be managed better with a translation partner on board. So those are just some of the benefits of offering it alongside your core service. But what are the big wins for your client if you are able to offer localization? Well, I think the key thing here is time. You're freeing up their time. Managing, from the feedback we receive from our clients, often there is, they underestimate just how much time this can take up. And we quite instrumental in helping them to manage that time and taking on some of those tasks. So it's taking that hassle away for them, giving them the peace of mind that you're handling the whole process, and that you're with the right translation partner in place. Obviously, you can involve all the right people at the right time in the right way, which is really key, because there can be a lot of people involved in the translation process, and it's all about making sure that those people are involved in the right way. Emily is going to share with you some tips on how to manage the review process, which can often be a sticking point in the translation process. How do you get the client involved in the most effective way to make sure those reviews happen and don't, and the project still moves along and meets the deadlines that you've agreed?
Just before I sort of talk about the translation process, I can see that we've got a question in the chat about, does localization or translation apply not just to the content or the platform as well, the LMS? So it really depends on the requirement that you need, but most translation partners will be able to work with you in terms of implementing the translated content onto your LMS. So not only the text content, which quite often can be exported in an editable format, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute, but also the media elements of that as well. So any video content that you might have on an LMS that needs adapting to a foreign language, any imagery, that kind of thing, all of that content is translatable, and a translation partner can work with you to help you adapt that into the target language. So it's very much a recommendation from us that you do talk to a translation partner about how they can work with you in terms of implementing that. And I'll hopefully address that question a little bit more now as I kind of talk about the translation process in a little bit more detail.
Brilliant. Well, that's enough for me. I'm going to hand over to Emily.
Great. So I'm aware that we've got quite a lot of people with us today who haven't got that much experience with translation. So I thought before I tackle things in a little bit more detail, I'll just outline at a high level the translation process for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Obviously every project is different, but there are generally these key stages that apply to all projects. So first of all, you'll have the creation of the English master version, and sometimes that is as far as an e-learning project will go. But if you know at that stage that it's destined for translation, then I can give you a couple of what we would consider our top tips for how to prepare it for translation before launching the English version. Then you'll have the preparing it for translation. So I'll be talking a bit about how to work with the export files and making sure that you've pulled all the content together for translation right from the start. Then you obviously are looking at the translation process, so that's translation, proofreading, in situ review, that kind of thing. And I'll be talking a little bit about our best practice and our recommendations for making that process nice and smooth. Then we've got the client review, which can quite often be considered as a challenge, but it really doesn't have to be. So I'll be talking about the best ways to make sure that your end client is involved or the market is still involved, and how kind of important that involvement is. And finally, then you've got the finalisation of the translations and putting that all back on. So whether it's an LMS like Richard has mentioned, or authoring tools like Storyline and Adapt, I'll be talking a little bit about how we can make that work as well. So in an ideal world, when you're creating the English content, you'll know from the offset that it's destined for translation. If that's the case, and it not always is, I understand that, there's a couple of things that you can kind of bear in mind to make your life a little bit easier down the road. For example, you've got puns and poems and humour. So this kind of creative content, it can add a really good flair to your content. It can really help engage the learner. And when you're translating or thinking about translating this content, you want to make sure that it's going to have the same impact on your learner in a different market than the English does. So we'd recommend that you talk to your translation partner at this stage to discuss the options for making sure that that translation does have the intended impact. So it might not be a case of straightforward translation. It might be what we would call transcreation, which is a creative translation option that does involve a little bit more input from the translator, but it really can pack the punch then that the English content does as well. For example, I was working on a project a couple of months ago that had a poem in the form of a video, and obviously the English was really great because it was rhyming and there was puns involved. But if you were just to translate that straight into French with no kind of thought for the wordplay, then it wouldn't have that same kind of influence on the learner and kind of, making them laugh in the same way. So it's just about thinking, how can we make sure that the translation has the same effects? Similarly, when you're putting in idioms or colloquial terms of phrase, just bear in mind that some English sayings don't always have the straightforward equivalent in another language. So for example, in English, you might have a frog in your throat, but in French, you'll have a cat. So if there's any images related to those kind of sayings, just make sure that they translate across as well. Similarly, pop culture references, if they're specific to a particular region, like in the UK, I worked on a website before that mentioned the Wurzels. It's very unlikely that anybody in France or Germany or further afield will have any idea who they are. So it's just making sure that those are adapted as well. And also when you're looking at images and videos, quite often there's text embedded in that on screen. So it's just being aware that that will also need to be translated as well. It's really easy to update text and images that's created in InDesign or Illustrator, but it's more complicated for anything outside of this. So if it's hard-coded into the module, or if on videos, if it's created in Adobe After Effects, that's fine. But anything sort of more complicated than that, it's worth bringing your translation partner on board at this stage just to talk about potential solutions. And there is always a solution, but it's just kind of bearing it in mind at this stage if you know that it's going to end up in a different language at a later stage. So I'm just going to take a pause here in case anybody's got any questions or anyone wants to share any experience of this. It'd be great to hear. I'll just give you a couple of minutes.
Presume you have to translate alt text too.
Yeah, so our general rule is if at the end of the day anything, if there's anything that you don't want to stay in English once it's all been translated into another language, then it needs to be sent for translation. So it's about thinking about, how can we share this with our translation partner to make sure that it is translated. And it's the best solution is making sure that it's in editable format. But like I've said, if you can just involve your translation partner in these discussions, they've probably come across it before and they'll have a solution in place for adjusting it. So I don't think anybody's got any questions at this point, but please feel free to pop up if you do. I'll just move on to a couple of other tips for you at this stage. So not every language is the same length. It's probably not something that people with limited experience of translation have really realised, but German, for example, can take up to 2.5 times the space that English does. So if you are thinking about creating translation or content destined for translation, then it's just about leaving additional space for the text to grow. Otherwise, when you're putting everything back in at the end, it might have a bit of a problem, and it might have a bit of a delay on our project schedule. So I've got an example here from Richard. My fable example in Spanish, no es moco de pavo, literally translates to in English as it's not turkey snot, but is the English equivalent of its small change. That's exactly right. And I love those kinds of examples. It's just great. Like it's raining cats and dogs in English. You know, how many languages does that translate exactly? So thank you so much, Richard. That's a really great example. Thank you. And another top tip that I have, it might be tempting to kind of rephrase yourself to avoid repeating yourself, especially with things like feedback screens or intros, but this can actually be a real asset for you. So translation partners can offer discounts on repeated phrases. So any sentences that are repeated word for word, quite often translation partners will offer you a discount on translating this multiple times. So depending on how much content you've got that is repeated across the content for translation, it can actually save you a huge amount of not only money but time as well, because the translators have already translated it once and it can just be repeated then throughout the project. So that's it in terms of making sure that you are planning for translation right at the start. So before I move on to the translation process itself, I just want to open this up and hear about if anybody's got any experiences. I know there's a couple of people that already work with a translation partner, so it'd be great to hear about how you rate your experience so far. So we'll just launch a quick poll to hear about that.
It'd be great to hear in terms of, what were the key drivers of a particularly good experience? What do you think was key to making that work? And if your experience hasn't been great, what do you think was the key driver for that?
Be interested to hear of any challenges that you've come across.
I've just tweeted Richard's example. I think it's excellent.
It is, it's fab. That's such a good one.
Yeah.
We'll go and retweet.
Yeah, definitely.
Just a few more people to vote.
Natalie shared, this is my first time on a translation project, so
It's very timely, Natalie.
Yeah, hopefully we can make your life a little bit easier by giving you some advice.
Brilliant.
Okay, let's see the results.
Okay.
So we've had one person that went quite well, so that's good to know, and hopefully some of these top tips that we're about to share will be quite familiar, or if not, we can hopefully make the next one go even better for you. And most people haven't managed any translation projects yet, so hopefully we can avoid any disasters for you and give you some really good advice to get started.
Perfect. Right.
Great. So as I mentioned earlier, every translation project is a little bit different, and likewise each translation partner will work in a slightly different way. But here's just some of our top tips from our experience, and they all come from projects that we've done in the past, so hopefully they'll start to ring true for some of you who've worked with translation before. So the first one is, as tempting as it might be to get the ball rolling on translation, we do recommend that you wait until the client or the market or whoever your stakeholders might be, that they do sign off the source version before translation starts. Even if there's very small changes that will be made, this can have an impact on the project schedule or consistency or anything like that, and it's not worth the headache, and quite often you can save a bit of time by waiting for that English version to be signed off. So as excited as you might be to launch the translation process, just give it a few more days and I promise you it'll make your life so much easier. Secondly is exporting and working with translation export files. So your translation partner should know how to work with these export files, and they might even be able to export them for you. So just to give you a few examples of what I mean by translation export files, Storyline, for example, can export for translation specifically into a bilingual Word file, so that's English on the left hand side or whatever your source language might be, and space for the translation on the right hand side. It can also be exported into an XLIF, which is a similar kind of a format where it's bilingual. Evolve can export into what's called a JSON file or a HTML, and similarly your translation partner will be able to work with all of these. So why is it important to work with these translation export files? Well, for starters, it saves you so much time from copying and pasting. It also reduces the margin of error, so if you're manually having to copy and paste out, it might be that you miss things off, or some things might not be visible, so buttons, for example, or labels or anything like that, then it just removes the margin for error. So Matthew was asked if Adapt can export. Yes, it can. Yes. I think it's JSON, which is the easiest export from Adapt, and translation partners will have the capability to put JSON files from Adapt into their translation memory software, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. Elucidate, I think it does as well, but I will double check, and I'm always happy to answer any questions that anyone's got about specific authoring tools a little bit later down the line.
Just to add to what Emily said, at the start of the process, it's worthwhile doing a test and work with your translation partner to test that import-export process. That's what we tend to do. We'll do a kind of create some dummy files and do a test run just to make sure everything's working, and then adapt or make changes to that process as needed.
Yeah. So another great advantage of these export files is that most authoring tools, at least the ones that I've worked with regularly, will have an easy re-import option as well. So again, you're not sat there for days on end copying and pasting the translations back in. Also, it means that obviously not everybody's a linguist when they're working on the technical side of things, so you won't have to worry about, is this word in the right place, is my sentence split properly, and it also includes all the content. So we really recommend working with these translation export files, and if it's specific authoring tool or an LMS that you're not quite sure how to work with an export, then it's worth contacting your translation partner to see if they've got any experience with this, and they can hopefully offer you some advice on how to get those files out. So we've got a question here from Joan about do we only use native speakers to translate? Yes, we do. So it's our recommendation that you only use native speakers to do the translations. So for example, the way that we work on recruiting our linguists, they have to be a native speaker. They have to have a certain amount of experience, certain number of years of experience, and they have to have evidence of working in a specific subject area for us to use them. So we always try and make sure that we are tailoring the linguists that we use on a project to that specific subject area, be it human resources or something a little bit more technical like finance or technology. We always try to make sure that we are catering specifically to the needs of that project using the right linguist.
And we have also got a very sort of complex or very detailed QA process. So the linguist, as all the work they're doing is being QA'd by other linguists within the translation team to make sure that quality and the terminology and so on is all exactly as it should be.
So another one of my recommendations is make sure that everything that needs translation has been sent at the start of the project. So not just the text elements, which will hopefully be included in these translation export files, but things that sit outside of the text. So any images, any video, anything like that needs to be included. Sorry about that, that's our fire alarm. So anything that sits outside of the text element, it needs to be sent across to your translation partner at the start, just to make sure that not only has it been included in terms of word count, but it can also cause a few delays on the project side if that's added later on in the project. So just to make sure that you've really thought about everything that needs to be included and sent that across to your partner. And finally, just a quick note about translation memory software. So an experienced translation partner will work with translation memory software, just to kind of give a bit of an explanation as to what that is. It's not Google Translate, so have no fear, but a translation memory will store everything that has been translated for a particular client in a particular language. And this is so important, especially for learning and development, because we know how quickly needs change. You're constantly having to update content, and storing translations in a translation memory means that any updates to that content can be done quickly and cheaply, because it's only going to look at things that have changed compared to the previous version stored in the translation memory, and it'll just be really easy to identify what does need to be updated the second time or third time round. So we really do recommend that you work with a translation partner who has access to translation memory software. Just going to pause here. I realise I've been talking for a little bit, so if anybody has any questions at this point, please do feel free to share them, and I'm happy to address them. So we've got a question here about Google Translate. Machine translation definitely has its place in terms of gisting or that kind of basic level content. For anything that has a great deal of creative input or wants to make sure that key understanding is the key element, we really wouldn't recommend machine translation for e-learning content. You want to make sure that your learner is understanding everything that's on the page, and machine translation doesn't lend itself spectacularly to that. It will give you a very basic gist translation, but in terms of any sort of cultural understanding, any complexities of language, it's not equipped to handle that.
No.
So we do recommend that a human translator completes the translation of e-learning content, because they're the only ones really who can deliver, you know, a professional, clean translation that will really engage your learner in the way that you want it to.
I think the other thing just to say about Google Translate is obviously around confidentiality. that it's not a confidential. Once the content is in, it's in the system, so to speak. So there is issues around confidentiality. But just to echo what Emily said, I think it's got its place if you need a brief understanding, but to actually communicate clearly and confidently, and avoiding any potential miscommunications and so on. I think if it's being used for email correspondence and so on, one of the things I always suggest, if you're going to use it for email correspondence, just to have a brief chat with somebody and you want to use Google Translate, it's worth saying that you have used Google Translate, so that there isn't any chance of it covers you if you've inadvertently said something that you shouldn't have said.
So my favourite example of this, I think I saw it on Tesco, where they had put, they wanted to translate alcohol free, so containing no alcohol, and they put it into Google Translate and it had come out as free alcohol, which obviously is not probably their intended meaning. So it's just to kind of bear in mind at this stage anyway, machine translation is not the best solution for complicated and creative content like that.
You can also, the other thing is you also get a slightly different translation each time you put something in.
Yes, that's true. So
it's just, there's lots of scope for confusion there. So I think, yes, we acknowledge it and very much understand it has its role, but used with extreme caution.
But great question, Richard.
Very good question.
So if there's no other questions at this point, I'm just going to move on to talk about your client review. So if you're working with a translation partner, then your client isn't handling the translations themselves, but we do recommend that they are still involved in the process. Involving your client as a reviewer can often be seen as a challenge, but it's actually a huge asset to the translation process. So the key to success is just making best use of everybody's times and skills. So you're combining the linguistic expertise of a professional translator, but the specialist in-house knowledge of company specifics for your end client or market. So translation is very subjective. There's a different, just like there's a million different ways to say something in English, there's the same in any other language. There's not just one way to say something. So it's inevitable that your client or end market is going to want to make changes to that translation. So it's all about making sure that you've got a process in place to make it a lot easier to manage if there are any changes that are requested. So the first thing that I would recommend, or we would recommend as a translation partner, is to have a sample. This doesn't have to be huge. Depending on the size of a project, it can be 500 or 1,000 words, just at the very start of the project. And this allows your client or stakeholder to have an early opportunity to direct the direction or guide the direction of the translation, especially in terms of style or tone of voice, or any key terminology that they can highlight at this stage, to make sure that they'll have to make fewer changes at a later stage in the project. So it's an opportunity for them to kind of share any initial feedback, and to make sure that you are on the right lines before you launch into a full project.
Jones asked how many languages for the sample. So you would do a sample per language.
Yeah, definitely.
If you were testing out and trying to assess the translation partner as a partner for you, then you could ask them to do samples, and we do that for clients, and then it might be a selection of languages that you'd ask the translation company to do a sample on, but for an actual specific project it would be a sample per language.
And Josepha has asked about short vocabulary terms. Yes, absolutely. So that's that was my next point. Any reference material or style guides or glossaries, like Josepha has mentioned, that's a huge asset, and it can often limit the amount of feedback that a client will have on a translation. So if there's anything that your stakeholder can provide in terms of guidance like that, then we definitely recommend it. So that's great. And finally, we would recommend a full market review, even if you don't take up a sample. And we would recommend that this is done in a bilingual environment, so that the translator or the reviewer, has got access to the English and the translation. Then that makes it easier to make sure that their changes are made in full awareness of the context, and it makes it easier to introduce changes at this point rather than once the translations have been implemented into their final environment, whether that's an LMS or an authoring tool like Storyline. Making the changes before the translation goes into that situation is a million times easier, because the changes are made before kind of finalisation. So we would definitely recommend that market review happens at the particular stage that it does. So I'll just pause again quickly before finishing up to make sure that nobody has any questions about the client review.
I posted one about the market review term because I'm not exactly sure. I think it's maybe part of your in-house.
Oh, great. Yeah, so sorry for any confusion there. Market review is if there's a native speaker in your end client, such as, in the French office or the Chinese office, we would recommend involving them in the translation process. So once the translations are complete, then we would send them on to a market reviewer, is what we call, so that the French HR manager or anything like that, to make sure that they have approved the translations before they kind of go into that finalisation stage. So hopefully that's got...
they would also be reviewing the sample.
Yes, so we would recommend the person who reviews the sample also reviews the final.
And I think that is a key thing, is that there's the consistency there. So you want to make sure that the person reviewing the sample at the start is also the same person reviewing at the end. And if there's a need for multiple people to be involved in the review process, it's making sure that you get consensus, and there is consensus before it goes back, before the content goes back to your translation partner, to apply those changes.
Yeah, so it's somebody based ideally in that region or that country, who have understanding of the company, the values, the terminology, that kind of thing.
And Richard has a question about right to left languages.
Oh, that's a really good question. So for languages like Arabic, where the direction goes from right to left, that is definitely something to bear in mind when you're creating the content. It's also something to bear in mind when you are doing the translations and putting them back in. So you'll need to be aware that the font that you created the English module in, for example, might not support the foreign language characters. So it's worth discussing it with your translation partner to see if they can recommend a font that can support the language. I would also recommend involving your translation partner during an in situ language review. So that's once you've put the content back into the authoring tool or the LMS, just having your translator log in and see it in context before it's launched publicly, to make sure that the text is displaying correctly. There's no funny line breaks. There's nothing that might confuse or alienate a reader in that language. So definitely that's a really great question. It is.
Yeah, and the right to left issue or those kind of things would also be picked up in a test import export process at the beginning. So those are the kind of issues that would be good to kind of tackle and get them addressed early on.
Definitely, and we would recommend that a little bit of more time is factored in for the implementation of those languages as well, just to kind of allow for any changes that need to be made because of line breaks or text direction or anything like that. So great. Just to finish up then, just a couple of questions that if you haven't onboarded a translation partner yet, that these might be some good questions to ask them to make sure that they can really meet your requirements. So can they handle authoring tool exports like I've talked about this morning? Can they take care of any additional language services, so not just the translation of the text, but can they do foreign language subtitling of videos? Can they offer multilingual voiceover? So if there's a video that's got an English speaker, can they change that and overlay a French or German or Chinese speaker on top of that? Can they do the desktop publishing? So that's changing the text that is included in images. How can they help with the review process, so involving your client and having their sign off on the translations? Can they help with implementing the translations into the content? So if it's an LMS or an authoring tool, can they potentially take that work off your hands or work with you to make sure that that goes really smoothly? Are they ISO accredited? How serious do they take quality, and what kind of steps do they have in place to make sure that that's a guarantee for you? And often if they've got experience working in an e-learning environment, then can they think of any other ways from your point of view to streamline the process and make your life easier?
Obviously, with an ISO quality accreditation, they should be independently audited to check that they're adhering to those quality procedures. So that kind of accreditation is really very important when you're looking at quality.
And just a quick summary here of some of my top tips. So make sure that you keep your content as culturally neutral as possible, or involve your translation partner to think about how you can keep some of those references. Work with translation experts as much as possible. Include a review as part of the translation process, and keep your translation partner in the loop during quoting stage if you are working with an end client, because they might have ideas about how to tackle content that's particularly challenging or manage costs to make sure that they don't get out of hand. So Joe's got a quick question. So someone based, can you give us an idea of how much time you might allow in the schedule for translation, e.g. into 4 European languages? So the way that we estimate that is based on word count. We normally say that a translator can do between 1,500 and 2,000 words a day, factoring in as well any proofreading stages, which we recommend in the same way that you'd have someone proofread in English content before it goes to the masses. We would recommend onboarding a second linguist as well, just to have a final quality check. Also taking into account any in-house quality procedures that we would also recommend.
There's also, the kind of things that also impact the time is, for example, the client review stage.
Yes.
So that is something that can take up a bit more time than initially planned. So if once for example, the sample that needs to would go out to the client for review, it's dependent on how long it takes to get that feedback back again.
So that links really well to that last top tip that I've put on the screen there. Keep your translation partner in the loop, because they can put together a delivery schedule taking into account all those individual stages, so translation, QA check, market review, and they can help you communicate that back to your end client as well, to make sure that you've got a process and a schedule in place to avoid any kind of unnecessary delays or miscommunication.
Perfect.
So that's it from us. Thank you very much to everybody who's joined us, and thank you so much to the eLN for letting us run this webinar as well today. If anybody's got any questions, then feel free to pop up. At this point, we can also take people off mute if they want to share any particular experiences or ask any questions. So thank you very much.
Great. Does anybody have any questions or anything they would like to share?
And there's a feedback poll on the screen as well for anybody who wants to let us know how we did.
Great, thank you very much, Natalie. We're glad it was helpful for you.
Oh, that's great, and thank you, Matthew. That's really nice feedback as well. It was very insightful.
And Angelica also commented earlier she had to leave for a meeting, but yeah.
Great.
Oh, great feedback. Excellent. It was very, very informative. Brilliant. I can tell that you're very organised, which you have to be if you're dealing with 17 languages.
I think my record so far has been 32 languages. Yeah. So yeah, definitely.
We like those kind of projects. The more languages, it's
the merrier. Yes.
Bring on. We like the challenges.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I'd like to do is just bring it back to my screen, and I'll just finish off by telling people about other stuff that the eLN is doing. So if people have captured your details there, do you want to write them in chat just in case?
Yeah, I'll pop them in the chat for you now.
And then if I share my screen, so I just wanted to point out that we've got a number of events coming up. Obviously today's is up there still for the webinar, but we're actually having a webinar from Brightwave next month at the end of September, and we'll publish the details of that soon. If you are anywhere near Glasgow or fancy a trip up there, we've got an event there next Friday where we've got 3 different lots of speakers and then an informal kind of unconference in the afternoon. And then we're running a virtual reality event in September as well on the 20th in London. So that's really for people who just like to learn more about what VR can do. and it will be quite hands-on. And we've got a social meetup in Leeds coming up in October, and we'll have another one, I think, in London that month. And then our big event of the year is our annual conference. So just to recap, if people are interested to know what they can get from being a member, you know, we've got mentoring support, as I said, conference discount, etc. And actually, yes, we'll be electing new governors, new directors towards the end of October, beginning of November as well. So lots going on, and it's only £29 for the year because we're not for profit. We don't need to make a lot of money here. So, okay, so I think we're just about there. Yes, people are rushing off to more meetings. I didn't actually share the results with you ladies here. Let me do that now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So thanks again. I'll wind it up there. And thanks again for signing up as an industry partner. Yeah, and I'll let you know when the recording's live.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jane. Thank you, everybody.